So guys, we are going to be starting the development unit. Actually, it's kind of the baby development unit. I'm calling it 1.5. Our standards actually come from the 7th unit, which is the last unit of the course. But there's some concepts that I feel like should not be left to the last unit of the course because they are concepts that run through the entire course. So kind of an addition to Unit 1. So let's get started looking at economic sectors and patterns. 7.2 is explain the spatial patterns of industrial production and development. The different economic sectors, including primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, quinary, are characterized by distinct development patterns. Let's put that in English that we speak. What that means is what kind of jobs do people do and where do they do those jobs? Every place in the world has different specialties, and that's what we're going to be looking at. Primary sector activities are activities that draw raw materials from the earth. So imagine taking something from the ground. If you're doing that, you are in the primary sector. So sometimes when we go on with this unit, students think, oh, primary, those are the poorest people. They make the less money. Not necessarily. There's a lot of money in some of these industries. So it has nothing to do with how much money you make. It's not like, oh, well, if you're a cashier at Walmart, you're in the primary sector. Absolutely not. You're not in the primary sector. So what this has to do with is how you're working with the earth. So if you're extracting from the earth, you are working in the primary sector. These are the main examples are mining, like pulling oil, petroleum, coal, fishing, agriculture, forestry, taking down trees, and anything that you're pulling from the ground is a primary economic activity. Secondary is when you take multiple raw materials, you put them together and you manufacture something, you make something. So for example, if you are a cloth seller, what you're doing is you are taking cotton that comes from the primary sector. So cotton actually grows on a plant. Some students don't know that. And you're taking that cotton and you're turning it into kind of a flossy thread, and then you weave it into a fabric. And so that is actually the secondary sector. So you can have secondary sector like you're making cloth, or you're taking cloth and you're turning it into clothes. That's another type of secondary sector. Or you're making iPhones, or you're making automobiles. There's all kinds of things that you're doing to put things together. Now, sometimes students get confused with construction because they think, oh, well, yeah, they're taking raw materials like trees and they're making houses, so it's sector, primary sector. No, it's secondary sector because they're taking trees and they're taking metals like in the pipes, there's metals. They're taking all of these things and they're putting together something that in the end is a house or a building. So that is the secondary sector. So the tertiary sector is the service sector, and this focuses on selling items. You can be working in a store, you can be working in a warehouse, you can be doing import exports, in charge of big business deals. It doesn't necessarily mean that in the tertiary sector you're high or low paid. It has nothing to do with that. There's all kinds of jobs if working in selling. So if you are selling something or you are moving goods, you are working in the tertiary sector. So here's some examples. We have retail, marketing, design, restaurants, and shipping. So the tertiary sector is broken down into quaternary and quinary. So quaternary and quinary are actually part of the tertiary sector. They're not completely separate. So I also teach economics. I'm not doing it this year, but when I teach economics, I actually don't teach my students about quaternary and quinary because they're not AP students. But since you guys are AP students, you're going to learn about quaternary and quinary. So this is a different level of tertiary. So, quaternary activities are knowledge based. They focus on research and information. And an example of that would be an investment banker, a college professor, somebody working in education, software developers. So anybody doing research in that industry. So let's talk about education for a minute. So I'm a teacher, I'm in the tertiary sector. But if I were doing research on better teaching methods, which I actually do all the time, but if I were doing that for a job, then I would be working in the quaternary. So in some ways it would be debatable that I'm maybe working in the quaternary too because I'm constantly learning new things to teach you guys. Um, but for the most part, quaternary are people who are working in R&D, research and development. And this can be like somebody who is a doctor and they're working to develop a new drug. Now, some people might be saying, okay, quaternary, like we go back to this again, that must mean they make more. No, it doesn't, not necessarily. If you're a doctor working in research and development, you probably make less money than a lot of the doctors who are practicing medicine. So, take, for example, a cardiac surgeon. A cardiac surgeon or what are the brain surgeons called? A brain surgeon, an anesthesiologist. Those guys make more than doctors that work in research and development. So working in research and development does not mean that you are going to be making more money. Okay, the quinary economic activity is the highest levels of decision making in a company. So there's not that many people that work in the quinary sector. So remember, they're in service. For example, the President of the United States is supposed to be in service of us, the American people. Um, and so they're technically working in service, but they're at the very highest levels. So CEOs of major companies, they're serving the customers. If they're not serving the customers, they're not going to keep their job very long. So they're still working in service. They're still in the tertiary sector, but it's a very special type of tertiary sector, and it often impacts a lot of money. Okay, so why are we talking about these sectors when we are learning about development? So development's really important. So let's talk about a couple of the terms. We have MDC and LDC. So MDC stands for more developed country and LDC stands for less developed country. And it's kind of the idea that there's countries that are on the continuum of being industrialized for a longer period of time. So, countries that you might think of as more developed would be the United States, would be England, would be Germany, would be Japan, would be South Korea. Those are more developed countries. They've been industrialized longer than some other countries. For example, Haiti, not very developed. Um, Equatorial New Guinea, not very developed. And then there's countries that are kind of in the middle of that, like Mexico, it's becoming more industrialized, but it has not been as industrialized as long as the United States. So, one of the things that's really important to note that as countries become more developed, they participate less in the primary sector. So I'm going to what color should I use? I'm going to use blue. So here we have the primary sector and so there's my blue. Yeah. So here's the line for the primary sector and it goes down. Okay. So as countries become more developed, you have fewer people involved in the primary sector. Also, as countries become more developed worldwide, you're going to have fewer people involved in the primary sector. So, for example, in 1820, most of the people worked in the primary sector, but by 2000, those numbers are really low. Now, let's see if I can erase that. Okay, I'm going to erase that because that's messy. Okay, now let's go ahead and look at the tertiary sector. So with the tertiary sector, so that remember, those are like sales jobs, you're selling things. So in 1820, it's pretty low. It's way down here in 1820, and look what happens. It goes up, 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 up. So in 2000, Most of the people are working in tertiary and far fewer are working in primary. And then secondary is kind of one of those that goes up and down. But in general, as countries become more developed, they move out of the secondary sector. For example, in the United States, when I was a little girl, there were a lot of factories in the United States. And there's still some factories in the United States, but for the most part, all of the factories have moved to other countries that are less developed. For example, Mexico, China, Bangladesh. So other countries that are left less developed. And the United States has far less secondary sector. Now, we still have plenty of construction, but we do not have as many factories here. So in less developed countries, the economy is mostly made up of the primary sector. So the lower the development, the the more people working in the primary sector. So Africa is a continent where many of the countries are on the very low developed continuum. And what are the people working in? They're working in farming, they're working in mining, they're working in forestry. And that work often is really, really labor intensive. So that's where they spend most of their time. They'll have some people working in the tertiary, some people working in the secondary, but in most of those countries in Africa, they are working in the primary sector, and the exact opposite is here. So, for example, when Donald Trump became president, one of the things he wanted to do was to bring back the secondary sector and also bring back more primary sector jobs. Um, but what he fails to realize is that as countries develop, they move away from those jobs, and it's really, really difficult to bring them back. And although for 4 years he's been talking about bringing them back, it hasn't happened because it's just not the way developed countries operate. Okay, so here in your own words, I want you to be able to explain the spatial patterns of industrial production and development and the different economic sectors, including primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, quinary, and tell how they are distinct in development patterns. So hopefully you can answer this now. You can explain this now. You can tell what this is about. If you can't, you need to go back and listen to the video again. And there's nothing wrong with listening to something twice, because remember, I've told you takes 7 layers of exposure to remember a new concept. So no harm in listening to something again to get the information again.